Hey, got it. So click got it. All right, so welcome to our little chat here. This is an idea that Dr. Wilson and I have been working on, and the two of us are with Colorado Technical University in the College of Computer Science, now Engineering and Technology. So we've expanded a little bit, and I think it makes the discussion point even more relevant when we're trying to understand realistic classroom feedback in the context. This is specifically for graduate students, but I think undergraduate students could benefit from this language as well. So for a outline of what we're going to cover, we're going to try and understand what we looked at in student learning and how they involve themselves in a classroom, what students today look like as opposed to students that might have traditionally gone to school, looking at the feedback that is very common in pedagogy and trying to understand how to better relate the two of those. So to pre-qualify, we have a lot of students that are not full-time students, right? So they work or they take care of somebody or they do something that takes a significant amount of their time. The traditional undergraduate student has all day to go to a meeting or go to a group or a club or something like this. And our students are largely in the work environment and have the burdens of having to provide economics for the household as well as try and plan for the future and grow for the future in going to class. So that being said, the first thing we tried to look at is what do the students learn like today? And we have some different areas in which we thought would be beneficial to understand. Most people understand done and done, right, from a learning theory perspective, that we have auditory, visual, kinesthetic, but we wanted to look a little bit more at the student reception of learning. So students looking at an environment, being part of an environment that they understand that they're comfortable with, can actually improve their achievement, their outcomes in the class, and how they want to fit in that class. So a lot of students are home now. And being at home, they're comfortable at home, they know their home environment, they can have monitors or stuff to be able to get. So the learning environment is more receptive. And if we think about Giddens structuration theory, then we influence our environment as much as our environment influences us. So when we have this meaningful outcome, it's more tied directly to the student's understanding than if they go into a classroom and the classroom is either too cold or too hot or a little bit sterile. And then finally, the last thing we wanted to look at was, does it matter that the students are online or in campus? And the answer is, well, largely no. There is not a significant difference in outcome from the modality. So whether it's hybrid, whether it's online or on ground, if the students' needs are satisfied from the perception of their environment, then it really doesn't matter what the environment looks like, is what we found in the research. And let's understand what the modern students are expecting from the environment today compared to their work, right? So the idea here is trying to give them feedback that they're more comfortable with and better understand. So we have this group dynamic that is not necessarily reflexive to group projects, but there's a group dynamic that's reflective to tasks and outcomes. When we want to look at a problem-based learning approach, it can't be completely theoretical to these students because they're accustomed to not being theoretical in the real world, right? They have learning outcomes and project outcomes that are based with some sort of expectation and realism. This project is due on this date. These modules need to be developed by this time. We have to meet this deadline to develop this policy. So we think that that type of approach, as opposed to a completely theoretical environment of just conducting research or just writing this paper that analyzes two components, we think that it's much more important. And Dr. Wilson has a lot of experience as an executive in industry And so along the line here, what I'll do is I'll ask him to interject his perspective on how it benefits the business and the industry, right? I mean, that's really why we're here, is we're here to educate, but largely the outcome is for the student to be a more beneficial impact to society, to their family, friends, all that kind of stuff, right? We want them to be better off and not just be learned people. And so if we're looking at this problem-based learning approach, Dr. Wilson, what are some things that you've seen in students as they take an assignment that has an outcome tied to realism versus theoretical?
The number one thing that I've seen, not only within the courses, but then also within industry as an executive, was that students in the theoretical type of course, their work product, so often they look at it as a reflection upon themselves, that they take their sort of self-worth, if you will, from that work product, where when it's tied to a much larger problem-based scenario, project with that's collaborative in nature, possibly with other students, that there's a common goal that we're working towards, then all of a sudden it sort of divorces that from the self-worth, and instead it's more of, how am I being a productive member of this team? And in industry, I saw that so often when someone would turn in their modules or whatever the case. If we could get them to think about it within the context of the overall product, we have to get to market by this date, by third quarter. We need the following things to have unit test, regression tested, whatever the case may be. Then all of a sudden it became more of a work product rather than a personal product. And I think that the idea of the feedback can help foster that. So that's my 2 cents on that, Derek.
And from these environments, students really look at school today different than they did in the past. And we don't know if it's because work more with less, the streamlined work environment, the amount of information that they're exposed to, but a lot of the responses that they give when trying to look at a work environment, when they're integrating education into it, as you could see, are lost, anxious, exhausting. Everything's a struggle. I can't get this stuff done on time. I can't figure out what I'm supposed to do. And when they're trying to incorporate that into their views of morality, what is okay, what is not okay, what is deemed acceptable, not acceptable, it becomes a fine line between plagiarizing and just not properly citing for the students as they work through these environments. So how does this type of feedback integrate with that as we're thinking of this perspective? Part of it is we looked at the memorization of facts as being important in the undergrad, but at the graduate level, students don't believe in memorizing facts because they can just get it anyway. Right? That's the most common response you'll hear when you ask someone to memorize something. Why? I can just look it up. And quite frankly, in the workplace, they're right. Most people, that's what they'll say. Oh, just go look it up. Just go research it. Instead of, you should know this to make this decision, it's becoming common criteria. So more critical thinking and more evaluative outcomes have been suggested, that this is why students don't care about memorizing stuff. So asking them to read these different chapters and this content for memorization purposes becomes lost on the student. And it's funny, so I added this note because I just read it the other day, that the student was so accustomed to their work environment and working at home that when they were asked to come into the office for a 6-minute meeting, literally 360 seconds, and the meeting was over, they literally quit. They said, this doesn't make any sense. I don't know why I'm here. I'm wasting my time. And that all gets back to environmental conditions and understanding where these students sit today versus how we looked at students in the past, or the comforts that student had. because their environment then was living on campus. Now the environment is living at home. So having to commute to the classroom puts them in a foreign area in which they don't respond as well. So we can understand and look at traditional feedback and say, okay, what did we do in the past? And so Dr. Wilson is going to watch the chat if there are any questions, so we can continue because we only have 10 more minutes. So if we understand traditional feedback, right, we have this idea of learning just as a pursuit of learning. I'm going to learn about whatever the core tenets are. I'm going to understand what the principles are here. I'm going to follow scientific method and rigor. I'm going to do root cause analysis. But if we look at the modern learner, they have a completely different outcome to learning. And it is 100% focused on job improvement from outside the company or inside the company, or even career change. All right, I'm going to move from this industry, and our focus in engineering is we have a lot of students going computer science and computer security. So what they want is they want to understand, how does this help me in my company, right? How can I do this thing to make more money for my company or make them more profitable? Or then finally, I don't care about these theoretical framework. I want to know how this thing fixes something in my organization. So the feedback method we find in shifting it towards either a personal project or an employer-based feedback can be better received if the students are accustomed to that in a working environment. And then when we think about what does this mean to our classroom, how do we have to change in our classroom? So some of the things are pretty easy to focus on, where you had the environmental and emotional, again, going back to done and done. If we have the environmental and the emotional components, some of those we need to understand from a work product perspective as much as the environmental perspective, right? Environmental doesn't just mean their home, it can also be the work environment. So when they're home, a lot of them now, that's in trying to take care of their family, they're also just work and school, and they need to be blended for a better outcome. When we're trying to look at these two from a design perspective, we're trying to look at the projects as well as the feedback and have them relate more to a student work product than a student learning product, right? Like if we go back to Edward Deming and we say, oh, well, we're going to paint the walls this color because it's more soothing, or we're going to change the seats to do this. We're more focused on the students being away from the classroom. So we want them to be in a work environment. So instead of worrying about light, temperature, sound, seating from the perspective of the student sitting in class, we want to make sure that they have an environment where they have time to be able to connect to a live chat, where they understand that here are the outcomes for the chat and what's going to go on with the other students in the classroom. How's participation going to take place? Why is it going to look like this? What's the long-term outcome going to be? And specifically for like responsibility and structure, I know that Dr. Wilson, when you're looking at hiring somebody, I know responsibility and structure and trying to understand the organization, even if they're a high performer, can be a significant difference between someone that persists and high turnover. Would you find that to be the case?
I would, most definitely. And I think the one aspect here that all of the participants, we obviously come from very different domains and probably very different disciplines. One of the things that we deal with in the sort of computer sciences, computer security, engineering aspect is that individual who is so good at what they do individually, but struggle at the communication aspects, struggle at the collaborative piece of this. And so those things tend to come out during those interview processes. And so the type of feedback that we're suggesting, moving more towards a corporate feedback as part of their learning, can help them make that transition.
So what are some of the adaptive elements that we're trying to consider. Oh, and since we didn't have that much time, we had polls, but with 20 minutes, I think after the first couple of slides, we see that the polls are just going to take too much time. So we'll skip on the polls. But thank you to the session host for having that prepared. What we wanted to look at and understand from an adaptive standpoint is to really look at it more from a student worker perspective than the student learner perspective, right? So the student worker perspective is getting feedback from their boss that is very different than, oh, well, in this paper, you didn't follow APA in your table of contents, and you only had one level instead of having two levels. In the work environment, what instead would happen is the person we're submitting this to has a high attention to detail. And so it's really important that you focus on the table of contents as the first thing that they read. So it gives them a little bit different perspective, even though it's the same feedback. It gives them a different perspective of how it should sound and how it should look in their work environment is the same as what they're hearing from their education environment. So some of the feedback we've had was beneficial, that the students really felt more connected to the projects. They felt that they could do a project and talk to people at work about it, because it wasn't this, ivory tower, up in the rarefied air professor type speak where a student is talking about something purely theoretical. They felt they could really connect with their employees and especially their employers and demonstrate, look, I'm learning something that's a value add to this organization. And when we were looking at the shift between how do you change the overall class to fit these learners, instead of just changing the assignment, just completely change the assignment and that'll fix it. We had to look at the mentality and adopt the mentality of these student learners and understand, why are they not doing as well? Why do they not listen to the feedback? I'm writing so much feedback and none of it's making sense. So when we made this shift to look at employability and that feedback coming the other direction, not just for the student going in, which is what we want, but the employer coming back and saying, this is beneficial to having somebody come into the organization, we found it very positive. So I don't know if we have time questions. If we want to open that up, our session host, we have a couple minutes.
Yes, we have about 2 minutes. Lori Poole did ask if you have any sample rubrics or exact wording used, anything specific to share. That's one question I saw in the chat.
Yeah, I jumped in and answered that real quickly, and it's just for everyone and for you, Dr. Sedlack, is that because time was short, rather than give all these examples that we have used, what we wanted to do is just lay an abstraction upon you as far as here's the concept and the idea. If this is definitely of interest, I would suggest contacting either of us, and we will be more than happy to provide some actual feedback that we gave to students in this endeavor.
Great, thank you.
All right, well, I guess we have give you a couple minutes back to your afternoon. We do want to appreciate very much your time and attention, would like your feedback to see if anybody finds this to be of interest or something you want to try and implement in your environment. And again, we specifically worked with grad students because they're working. And it seemed more appropriate for us at the grad level here for the pilot purpose than starting it all over the place and seeing if it applied in both. So if you have grad students or you have undergrad students that are remote students or commuter students, then this is something that we think is worth consideration. So we appreciate your time and attention, and hope you have a great afternoon.
Wonderful. Thank you for the presentation.